Hello and welcome to Lecture 6. This is the last lecture of our course, and we're going to be talking about the regulatory landscape. In the world of medical advancements that we've been discussing to date, our medical science startup will often be in the forefront. And this is because the domain that we operate in involves developing new drugs, biotech solutions, and/or medical devices. Now, our startups navigate a very challenging landscape because they are tasked with translating novel scientific discoveries into products that can successfully pass through the stringent regulations of healthcare markets. And despite these hurdles of complex regulations and often lengthy and iterative development cycles, our startups are frequently basically the birthplace of innovative treatments and technologies, and most of this relies on the requirement for solid funding and strategic alliances in order to be successful. Let's talk a little bit about regulatory bodies. Well, there's one in every jurisdiction, and it is essentially a governmental entity which has as a mandate to ensure the safety and efficacy of all medical science products in that jurisdiction. Some examples that I'm sure you've heard of is, of course, Health Canada in Canada, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, in the United States, the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, in the EU, and those are the for us, of course, being in Canada, those are the three most important that you would think of. But remember, every jurisdiction will have a regulatory body. So, of course, in Asia and China and any Costa Rica and every country, you will have one. But these are the three big ones in terms of market access, right? So inevitably, North American market is a very lucrative market, as well as Europe, and so those are the reasons why we're probably going to focus on these three for this course. The important thing to remember is that wherever you wish to enter the market, so whichever jurisdiction that market that you're interested in exists, you need to be approved by their regulatory body. So it doesn't mean that because you got regulatory approval by the FDA in the United States, great, good for you. But does that mean that you can sell in Canada? No, you need to have the regulatory body of Canada, which is Health Canada, approve your product as well. If you've been approved by the FDA, does it make it easier to be approved in other jurisdictions? Yes, certainly it does. You still have to go through the same process, but inevitably, because you've been approved somewhere else, the chances are far greater that you will be approved in any subsequent jurisdictions. Okay, so within your medical science company, you will have a department that will be called Regulatory Affairs. And it will play both a strategic and functional role in ensuring adherence to the regulatory mandates of your jurisdiction, or jurisdictions if you're global. Now, this field spans a variety of tasks from creating regulatory strategy within your company, preparing submission documents for product approval, to maintaining compliance with ongoing regulations. Professionals in this area will serve as the vital intermediary between their company and the regulatory agencies. They'll guide product development and marketing to stay within the bounds of legal and scientific requirements. And so that's an interesting one that you think, oh well, these guys are just these employees are just going to be working towards documentation, essentially making sure that all the documentation is in place for regulation. But they do more than that. So meaning that your department is also going to be involved in product development and marketing, and that's because once you've decided on a class, if you wish, that you're going to operate in, your product is going to operate in, you have to make sure it stays there. So you're probably thinking, well, what are you talking about? Well, it's because the class is determined by what the product does, what the risks are involved with it, but also very importantly on the claims that you make about that product. So if you, for instance, start with a class one medical device software, let's say, and that what that means is that that software is going to be used pretty much exclusively by the patient, right? And it's going to be informative for the patient about their health, right? Whatever that might be. And so that makes it a class one medical device. Now the information from that is usually non-physiological. So I mean it's not measuring something in let's say a blood test or anything like that. It's just informational. And if you make the claim that, hey, I have this software, if you use this software, if you purchase my software, it's going to help you manage something about your disease or about, let's say, diet or something like that, that's going to be informative to the patient from a medical or health standpoint, then that's class one medical device. But if you then escalate your claims, so you actually then start claiming that it can diagnose something. So meaning that if you use this software and you put in all the information, it will actually tell you or diagnose you with let's say type 2 diabetes, right? Well, if your software is now diagnostic, so meaning it's actually making a claim that it can diagnose that you have diabetes, then that immediately escalates your class to class 2. And so you have to be very careful that even though your software may be in a position to make that diagnosis, if you claim it, then you have to be, you have to operate under the class 2 regulatory status. And so, companies can get caught that way in the sense that they have this product that starts off as a class one that's just informational. And then there's this slow creep that they realize over time that their software, if they just tweak it a little bit and they put a few updates out, that they can actually be more than what they were saying originally. So then they need to progress to a class 2. So meaning before they make that claim public, they need to actually get their regulatory affairs office to connect with the regulatory body and make sure that they are ready and equipped to operate as a class 2 medical device. So that's the importance of your regulatory affairs department. So more often than not, when you start talking about regulation or regulatory bodies, the first thing that pops to mind generally is drug regulation. And it's no surprise because the regulation of pharmaceuticals is an extensive, multi-phase endeavor that is crucial to confirming a drug's safety and therapeutic efficacy. So you start with, of course, the preclinical trials. You then advance through multi-clinical trial phases with each step designed to collect required and targeted data with the ultimate goal of achieving market authorization. So properly navigating these phases is vital for the success of any drug. And the path of the drug to market is a long one. It is also a very expensive one. And interestingly, the foundational research that is involved in order to discover the drug, to develop the drug or the compound, is generally a smaller component and a less expensive component. So you can say, oh, wait a minute, how about paying all the grad students and postdocs and the faculty and the grants? And well, I mean, surprisingly, you can pretty much do foundational research fairly cheaply is the wrong word, but on a fairly or relatively low budget. And the reason for that is it kind of makes sense because that's what the government would like, right? So academia, that's the role that academia plays, is foundational research, and everyone knows how important foundational research is for discovery or for innovation. So inevitably that happens at academic institutions that's supported, heavily by the government. The next phase, which is path to market, is a little different. because the path to market means you're moving towards a for-profit endeavor of selling the drug, right? And so in that case, the support by the government is much, much less. It's still supported, but it's much less because what the government would like is that industry support the path to market, and so that it makes sense. And so that's once again that's the partnership that exists between academia and industry, and both are very important for the success of bringing a drug to market. So the regulatory pathway starts at preclinical testing, and then it is followed by clinical trials, generally 3 phases, and then you have your market authorization, which is the final approval of your regulatory body for you to sell your product in market. Now, this pathway, of course, there are variations to it depending on the product or the compound, but generally that is what is needed or required for you to get from foundational research with an MVP to selling your product on the market. What you will need to do is make sure that this pathway is clearly described for you for a given product and for in a given jurisdiction. So that's something you're going to have to make sure your regulatory affairs department is working on. And I would say start working on it earlier rather than later, because as I said, the regulatory considerations will actually also help shape product development. And so you want to be starting to think about it early on. So in the earlier phases of drug development is going to be preclinical testing, and this is where potential drugs or compounds are subjected to rigorous in vitro and in vivo analysis in order to evaluate their safety, of course, first, and then biological function. Now, this foundational stage, which adheres or should adhere to good laboratory practice regulations, is essential for ascertaining a compound's suitability for human trials, which is the next phase, correct? Now, also remember, if you're working with a medical device, you may be working with like a class 1 or a class 2 device, which is not ingested, like drugs are, which is a big deal, right, for safety. But this is, let's say, for instance, a Band-Aid, which is a class 1 medical device. It's still a class 1 medical device. So do you need to do preclinical testing? Well, yeah, you do. But in this case, you may almost consider it as, the engineering part of your work. So meaning that you're producing a product, you're producing a thing, something, or even software, if you're producing software, that you are going to need to test it, right? And if it's going to operate in the world of healthcare, then it has to abide to regulations. So also remember that even if it's not a drug and it's a medical device, you are still going to have testing to do in order to make sure that it is safe. And that's something that, it follows the same protocols. It's just, it's going to be a little bit different depending on the level of the regulation. And it's also going to be a little bit different depending on what the product is and how would you would test it. But don't be fooled. All products ultimately need to be tested. It's just that some may be easier than others in order to perform that preclinical testing. Clinical trials represent a pivotal phase in the drug development life cycle. And this is because you're now assessing the drug safety and effectiveness in human subjects across several stages. And these range from the initial small scale safety evaluation to the much larger efficacy and comparative study. And all of these trials must adhere to stringent regulations. And this, of course, is to ensure patient safety throughout all of the testing, but also to safeguard the integrity of the data collected, which is then going to be used by your regulatory body in order to assess and approve your drug. So in the first phase, it's used in order to assess safety and dosage. The number of participants is small, and they are healthy volunteers. And the focus, of course, is to see how the drug is metabolized and any possible side effects. When you progress to phase 2, now you're looking at testing efficacy / effectiveness So efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is how well does the drug work in a very controlled environment. Efficacy is going to be how well does the drug work in a less controlled or uncontrolled environment, which means at home basically. You're taking it at home and there's no controls. Inevitably, in all of the phases of the clinical trials, they tend to be controlled because they're RCTs. So you're really testing efficacy, mostly testing efficacy if you wish, but inevitably as the trial gets larger and larger and larger and larger and larger, you're now moving towards effectiveness because it's your ability to control the environment in which the drug is working is less and less because it's so large and there's so many people that the chances of you being able to control everything is not possible anymore. So just bear that in mind. But essentially, you're testing for how well the drug works. And so in a phase 2, you're further evaluating safety, but you're looking for whether or not the drug works. The participant group is larger, and in this case, it's in the diseased population or people that have the condition. And your focus, of course, is always looking at short-term side effects and how well the drug works. You then progress to a phase 3, and this is once again to confirm effectiveness or efficacy effectiveness, to continue to monitor side effects and to now compare to other commonly used or gold standard treatments. Once again, the number of participants is even greater. And in what you're gathering, the information you're gathering, of course, as always, is safety and efficacy, but you are now studying this in different populations with different dosages. That's typically phase 3. Once you've collected all this data from these 3 phases, you then submit to the FDA for approval. They will go through it, and assess safety and effectiveness. They then give an approval, but it's contingent on, continued success, if you wish, of the drug and safety of the drug. And so that brings us to a phase 4 trial. A phase 4 trial is post FDA review. However, they're now looking to see if your drug continues to be safe and effective in a very large population. So in this case, it's going to be much greater. So, let's say 5,000-10,000, patients. But then you're also looking for more long-term effects. So is the safety, continued on a long-term, scale, if you wish, and that's going to be, are there new, safety concerns or side effects that are cropping up because they're on medication longer? But also there's the probability, right? So if you have a very rare side effect, well, the chances of you observing it in phase 1 is very small because there's very few patients. And then phase 2 is a little greater, phase 3 is a little greater. So phase 4 is that chance to potentially start observing, rarer side effects that were just not observed in your earlier phases, but will be now. And those still need to be considered. So if it's extremely rare and the FDA considers it still safe for the general population, then it will be continued. But if you have, like sudden death as a rare side effect, well, the FDA is going to, or Health Canada is going to say, wait a minute, I'm not sure if this is a good drug for us to continue to support, and then they may retract their support from a regulatory standpoint. Finally, securing market authorization is basically the process that follows your successful clinical trials, where your company will seek regulatory consent to market a new drug. Now, this meticulous review will involve a thorough examination of all data related to the drug's safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing by the regulatory agencies. And it's characterized by being very complex and very stringent scrutiny. So be prepared for that. Now in Canada, so Health Canada, it will be come under a new drug submission. This is for approval of all drugs, and in the United States, the FDA, it will be a new drug application, which is the classification for this one is for all small molecule drugs. So that's basically all the drugs that we know, other than it excludes biologics. So what are some keys for a successful market authorization from your regulatory body? So a good start is comprehensive data and documentation of your clinical and preclinical trials. This is like the groundwork, right? You must have this. Then you're going to have clear and accurate labeling, which is, sharing or disclosing side effects and risk. You're going to want to have very consistent manufacturing procedures. Once again, documented. You're going to have to, again, document all of your regulatory compliance, which means, are you meeting what is expected of you to be in market for a certain class, medical device or drug. And so that means, your Department of Regulatory Affairs, that's their job, is to make sure that the company and everything associated with your product is compliant. The next, of course, is your risk-benefit analysis. You're going to have to do a risk-benefit analysis in order to see if, it's worth bringing this product to market and how best to market it so that you are successful as a company, all while abiding to all regulatory requirements. Let's move to talking about medical devices. Now, the path to market authorization is going to look very familiar, but there are a few differences that you need to take into consideration when you're dealing with a medical device. So the regulatory journey for medical devices involves essential steps, just like for drugs, which is clinical testing and pre-market approval, especially for the higher risk devices, and all the while adhering to your manufacturing quality, system regulations, just like in the drug development. The pathway, of course, mirrors the rigorous process in drugs as well, and uses the same regulatory bodies, FDA, EMA, Health Canada. Now, one of the differences is that medical devices are separated into classes based on their level of risk. So, for instance, the class 1, which is the lowest level, is something like a toothbrush or a Band-Aid. So it actually does come in contact with, a human. However, the level of risk is extremely low, whereas class 2, it's a little higher risk, and in this case, it's because it's diagnostic. So, for instance, like a pregnancy test, or it would be, a device that is involved in treatment. For instance, that could be a class 2. A class 3 means that there's an additional level of risk, and for instance, here it could be contact lenses. So, meaning yes, it's coming in contact with the human body, if you wish, just like a Band-Aid and a toothbrush. But in this case, the level of risk is much higher because it's in your eye, right? It's on your eye. So the possibility of harming the patient is much higher. So then it's a class 3. If it's something that's actually inserted inside the body and is, let's say, like a pacemaker, is involved in making sure your heart is beating correctly, then that's the highest level of risk, which is the class 4. As you can imagine, the higher the risk, as you go from class 1 to class 4, you have a greater and greater requirement for data and for procedures and documentation. Finally, as you can see from this figure, the different regulatory bodies have slightly different categories or classes for their medical devices. The one I always refer to, of course, is in Canada, so Health Canada, and you have class 1 through 4. But in the United States, for instance, they only have 3 classes, and in the EU, they have 4 classes, but they call them slightly differently: class 1, class 2A, 2B, and class 3. So the regulatory pathway for medical devices includes your clinical testing, which we talked about, for instance, in drug testing, phase 1, 2, and 3. But in this case, it's human trials. You call it human trials for the device's efficacy and safety. But along at the same time, what you're going to be looking at is also testing it for its engineering, so the product reliability. So meaning if you're creating a product, like a mechanical product device, you're going to want to make sure you test it for its ability to be reliable and to continue to do what it's supposed to do error-free. So that's something you're going to do at the same time, or kind of at the same time. Probably you'll start with that one, and then you'll move to clinical testing, where you're going to see, of course, if it's efficacious and if it's safe, right? Once you've done that, then you're going to look for pre-market approval, right? So pre-market approval is where you're going to look for having reviewed and authorized your device manufacturing. So how it's manufactured, does it comply with requirements? And then you're going to look at your quality system regulations. So the quality system is what the regulatory body wants to do, is wants to make sure that what you have in place are all the procedures and the safeguards and the oversight that is required in order to continually manufacture this product with quality in mind. So meaning that you are going to generate the basically the same product moving forward over time, regardless of, let's say, supplier issues or where you manufacture. If you have multiple sites, you need to make sure that the product you're producing is standardized, right, and is safe, right? That's the most important thing. And so you have to have your quality systems in place, and they will check that. I mean, that's part of the documentation. And then finally, you get market authorization, which is once again your approval by the regulatory body. And if depending on the level, the class level of your product, you're going to it's either going to be a fairly easy, and I always say that not fairly, relatively easy process to do. So a class 1 is self-regulated, so that means that you're the one who's responsible for making sure you have all the documentation in place. When you submit, they're going to review it and they're going to say, yep, that's good, you're good to go, and then they will audit you. Like a year later or something, they're going to come in and they're going to do an audit. But to get that done, it's you're doing it yourself, right? So you're organizing all this documentation yourself, or your regulatory affairs department, and you put yourself in a position and start selling based on your own decisions, right? And then you get audited. That's generally how it works. If you have a class 2, that's not the case anymore. Now you have to get pre-market authorization before you can actually start selling, and so they will review and look at all the testing you did, all the data from your testing, all the documentation, and then they will give you the green light to go to market. Depending on your product as well, the level of risk, you're going to have to do, just like in drugs, you're going to have a stage 4 testing, which is going to occur after your approval. And this is going to be looking for long-term, either side effects or efficaciousness. So meaning that does it continue to work, as well as manufacturing, the ability for you to continue the manufacturing and error-free, essentially. And so that's what they're going to be looking for when they come back to audit, right? So they don't tell you when. They'll just surprise you. Surprise! You have an audit. Get ready for it. We'll be there in a couple of weeks. And then they'll come in and they'll assess everything. And then if they don't like what they see, they'll give you a warning to make changes if it's really minor. If it's more serious, then they lock you down. So they literally go and put a padlock on your warehouse and say you can't sell anymore until you address these issues, and they give you time. So whether it be 3 months, 6 months, or whatever it is, you have to comply before you can start selling again. One thing is clear about medical device regulation, and that is that it is complicated. Medical devices do not typically follow a linear regulation path that drugs do. They are very heavily dependent on the device class that you are considering and the jurisdiction you are in. When looking at this diagram, you will notice that the first bubble that follows medical device concept is compliance. So just keep in mind that when you are developing your product, you should be thinking about where you're going to end up in terms of regulation right from the beginning. And the reason for that is the way you ideate, the way you design, should already follow the documentation requirements for the regulation that you are going to need to be compliant with. And the higher the class, the more stringent the documentation requirements. And so you're kind of saying, what do you mean by documentation? You just have to write things down. It is more that you document your process. What led you to the design you chose and why? And when you were designing, did you take into account security, safety, right? These things, like, obviously first one is safety, right? Of course, that's the big one for health. But it's also privacy and security, right? So because your device may be managing private information and private health information, and if that's the case, then you have to do or complete what's called privacy by design. So meaning that right from the get-go, when you were designing your product, you were thinking about how you were going to protect people's information, as well as, of course, how are you going to keep your patient, your user safe in terms of a product. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about documentation. Then you're going to move on to how do you test it? How do you document the results from your testing? How do you make iterative changes to your product due to findings from your testing? All that, of course, needs to be very well documented as well before you submit it all, to your regulatory body for assessment. Now, this schematic just shows FDA, but you can imagine it is very similar, if not the same, whether you're in Health Canada or you're in the EU. Now, we've talked about design, we've talked about risk, we've talked about quality. So let's put them together. So there are three basic principles. There's your engineering and design, there's your risk management, and there's your quality management. So inevitably, ultimately, you would like a product that you can sell successfully. But in order to do so, you have to abide to standards that keep the user safe and secure, let's say. Now, if you sell a product that's not safe, then you're putting your company at risk. So that's risk management. So you want to minimize the risk of hurting or harming somebody, because that risk, if you do harm them, is going to shut your company down. Essentially, you're going to be shut down. That's the risk. So you don't want to do that. And that's the purpose of the regulatory body, is to make sure that that doesn't happen. So their oversight is to make sure everything is in place so that you're managing your risk of harming someone, according to their standards, right? So you're minimizing that risk of harming someone, and to an acceptable level, right? And of course, you're going to think, well, okay, how do I manage this risk? Well, the most obvious one is quality management. So meaning that, are you building your product to meet standards? So quality standards, meaning that, are you doing a good job of that? And is it consistent and always the same? And so that's the relationship between these three that you are constantly going to be addressing, because you may think, oh, when the product's done, we're done, and we're not going to be thinking about engineering. But that's not true, because inevitably there are going to be changes to your product. At some point, you're going to have to update it, upgrade it. There might be changes in supplier. And so then you have to make a minor modification to, how you assemble your product, or what parts you're assembling with, and all that fun stuff. And every time you do, then you have to reassess your risk management and your quality management because they're always involved. Let's talk a little bit about health software. So software that is going to be intended to be used specifically for, the health, or improving or maintaining the health of persons, right? Or the delivery of care, which in a way is also a way of maintaining the health of persons. So any software that's going to be involved in a medical device or act as a medical device needs to be regulated, right? It needs to meet regulatory compliance. And so you call software that operates within a medical device, you call it software as part of a medical device. And then if you only have software, so for instance, all the great fun in radiology, where you have software that's detecting, disease through, scans, you would call that software as a medical device. Now, whether it be software, whether it be hardware, whether it be hardware with software, all of it comes under regulatory compliance. But there are some subtle differences in terms of what standards need to be followed. So this figure here just gives you a high-level overview of what you can expect. So any company that sells a product that is considered a medical device, or a software as a medical device, must have that's classified, must have what's called a QMS, a quality management system, and it has to abide to the ISO standard, the international standard, of 13485. So that's all companies have to have that, and it's just to have your QMS, and which is basically documentation, right? So the correct documentation. Now, depending on your product, you're going to have to follow slightly different standards. So in terms of risk management, so how do you manage your risk? How do you assess risk? That's always the same. And once again, it's ISO 14971, and that's your risk management. And then you also have to follow for usability, so standards of usability, what's called IEC 62366-1. So that is just your usability. Now, if you are working with software as a medical device or software as part of a medical device, you will have different standards for the actual software. And so if it is a software as a medical device, it's IEC 82304-1, sure. And if it is software as part of a medical device, it's going to be IEC 60601-1. Finally, and this is, I would say, very important to remember, is for the software development process needs to follow IEC 62304. So I know you're probably already confused, and it is confusing. So the only thing is, what you need to keep in mind is, are you what's the oversight for? So what's the risk assessment for, right? So is it for the product itself? Is it for the software itself? Or is it for the development of the software? So for the software itself, then you're going to be considering 82304 or 60601, right? If it is how you develop the software, no matter if it's the software as part of a medical device or as a medical device, it is going to be 62304. So that's the way you develop the software for a medical device. So you're always following 62304. And then, just to remember, you have to have a QMS, which follows 13485. And then you also need to follow, for your risk management and your usability, two other standards, 14971 and 62366. So in a nutshell, that's what you need to keep in mind. And this little figure here just somewhat helps you in terms of, what's the intended use of your device. Is it, medical in nature, or is it other health use? And this will just help you decide if you have a medical device software, if you have software as a medical device, or if you have embedded software, which is just for health use, or if you have standalone software for other use. And this will help you determine, what standards need to be followed during your design, production, testing, and then deployment. Let's talk a little bit about the quality system, which is defined as the organizational structure, responsibilities, processes, procedures, and needed resources for implementing a quality management system, a QMS. So it all starts with quality control, which is a reactive system, so meaning that it is checking during production or implementation that everything is going according to design. So you have to meet certain specifications in order to say that your product has been well developed or manufactured. Now the QA is the system that develops the documentation that's going to be followed for any kind of testing or assessment or oversight. So the quality assurance informs the quality control of what to do, how to do it, when to do it, how often to do it, when is it a problem, when's it not a problem. All of that is preventative, right? So you're basically you're trying to prevent any kind of problem in the QC. So QC is reactive, quality assurance is preventative. And then finally, you have the quality management system essentially, so the quality management, and this is the framework. So you have to, in order to manage your QC and your QA, you're going to have a framework to follow to make sure that you're doing it the way that the company would like to have it done under regulatory affairs, for instance. Who's involved, who's not involved, who checks, who doesn't, who has access, who doesn't have access, and that's your quality management. So it coordinates the efforts. So the QC is the actual checking, the QA is the planning on how to check and the documentation required and what to do and all the policies and procedures. And then your management is the framework that permits you to plug everything together and make sure it runs smoothly and to check to make sure nothing is missed and that there are correct schedules, et cetera, et cetera. We now come to what's called market surveillance. And so this is just, we've already touched on this before, and it was phase 4 of drug trials. And it comes after market authorization, where you can sell your drug. And what you have to do is study the drug at a larger scale, and you're looking for more long-term effects. So whether it be positive or negative. So positive ones, of course, is how efficacious your drug is long-term. But the negative is, are there any side effects that you didn't notice that you are now noticing with the greater population and using it for a longer time? So in medical devices, it's exactly the same thing. You're going to have to do the same thing, even though you've received, your classification and you've received from your regulatory body your compliance, and you can move ahead, market authorization. Once you start selling, you still need to do exactly the same thing, which is your stage 4, market surveillance, where you're going to focus on performance of your product in market. So in this case, you're going to want to look, very importantly, you're going to want to look for unforeseen risks. So you may have done a fantastic job on the design and the production, the testing, everything's wonderful and works fantastic. The only thing is you don't have the experience of having that product in market for years, that long time, right? So you don't know if, after some weird, 5 years of use of your product, it catches fire. There's a fire risk, but only after 5 years, when the plastic has been subjected to heat and maybe sun and becomes, brittle and hard, and then there's a little bit of a crack, and then it shifts this and that, and then it heats up, and then boom, you get a fire. So that's not something that's easy to predict when you're in the design and testing phase, because you've never submitted it to 5 years of use. You can't do that, right? So that's where market surveillance comes in, because as soon as even one of your devices out in market catches fire and it's reported, you need to take action, right? Now, of course, that's dramatic, right? But it can also be, some minor things, like maybe smells, something like that your product, when it heats up, it starts to smell, but only after, 3-4 years of use or something like that. And, it's not dangerous. It's not catching fire. There's no smoke. It just smells a little funny. And people are saying, it kind of smells funny. So this is something that you're going to want to take into account and make sure that it is safe and it's not going to catch fire and all that fun stuff. And then, of course, you're going to change you should change your design. So this is where you're going to go in and make a change in your design so it doesn't smell, like it doesn't smell when it heats up or something like that. And when you do that, you're changing documentation. There's a whole process and procedure for you to make a change to the design, test it, make sure it's good and compliant, and then roll it out in the next edition of your product. So there's a way of doing that. And so anyway, that's the purpose of market surveillance. So here's an interesting concept, which I'm sure you've heard me talk in during the live sessions, is that you want to build a healthy, positive relationship with your regulator. And in order to do so, you can certainly schedule, meetings and check-ins with representatives. If you're that big and your product is that important, if you're a small company and a small little product, they're probably not going to, check in with you regularly. But if it's something big, you should definitely engage in workshops and training that could be provided by the regulatory body itself or something affiliated. And then, very importantly, is develop clear communication lines with your regulator or your regulatory body. And that means, what you submit, how you submit, what's the cadence of your submission, because you get to know your regulator and they get to know you, and so that just makes life easier. That if you're in a pinch, like something happens, and you're not sure, oh my God, I'm not sure what's going on here, I don't know what to do, that you can reach out to them and they're very friendly and they're just like, oh yeah, no worries, hey, nice to talk to you again, and then they give you some advice. If you don't have that line of communication open, then what happens is it just takes you longer to get what you need, and it could put your company at risk, right? Obviously, participating in industry forums or regulatory conferences, it doesn't have to be you, the founder, CEO, that does this, but someone in your regulatory affairs is going to do that, right? Your director of regulatory affairs or whatever is going to participate in that and represent your company, and that's probably, you're thinking, oh God, that just sounds like a lot of work, but it's really not. It's just making sure regularly that you're in contact, you're checking, you're reaching out, you're making sure everything's okay. Check, check, check. Everything's good, perfect, and you move on and you do it again. But just don't let it slide. Don't forget about it, because the day you need that relationship, you're going to be stressed and panicked, because it's going to be something that's happened, right? An incident or something, and you don't know, or there's a change in status or whatever, and you don't want to put your company at risk. And so that's why I recommend you do so. Health Canada is wonderful. My relationship with Health Canada has been just absolutely fantastic. They're always so responsive, always helpful. And so that's been fantastic. FDA, they're just bigger, and so it's more challenging with the FDA. But can you still do it? Yes, absolutely. And with the EU as well, EU is tricky because you have multiple member states that make up the EU, and so it gets tricky in understanding who you should be reaching out to. Is it going to be at the country level, the member state level, or is it going to be at the EU level? And so it does get a little trickier in the EU for sure. But once again, it's worth spending the time to make sure you do establish these relationships, and you do have contacts that you have on what used to be called speed dial. I don't know if we're doing that anymore these days. Maybe speed texting. And that's just something that you want to have at your fingertips as a company moving forward. So in order to deal with your regulatory challenges when you're in the medical sciences, you're going to want to allocate effort, resources, budget specifically for dealing with regulatory compliance and consulting if you can't do it in-house. This is going to come on top of research and development costs, and so it's really ideal for you to set aside the money, because you'll get caught if you don't. So, early startup companies won't think of the regulatory as something they really need to pay attention to right now, because all of their focus is on R&D. But when they do get to where they want to get, they have the product, they have their MVP, they're really excited about it, and then they think about it. Either they've exhausted all their resources or most of it, and they just don't have the money to address regulatory, and that's a problem. Or it's already too late, right? They're going to be behind. So instead of being able to get to market within the next couple of months of finishing their product, it's going to take them a year. And so that's just something that you really want to take into account. The other one is the problem of keeping informed about changes in the regulatory landscape, because it happens all the time. And if you're not kept in the loop, then you could be non-compliant. And to be found non-compliant is a huge, huge deal. And there is no excuse. You can't say, oh, the regulations change all the time. You guys are changing the regulations all the time. I can't keep track. And rah, rah. Not at all. It is absolutely your responsibility to stay abreast of all the developments, changes that would be occurring in the regulatory landscape that you are living in. And there's no excuse. So definitely set aside some time or personnel or resources in order to make sure that someone is looking out for you on any changes that may impact you, your company, your product. So how can you minimize potential regulatory roadblocks? It's actually quite straightforward. It is be consistent and review regularly. So meaning perform risk assessments on a regular schedule, right? And this will just identify potential regulatory issues that could pop up in your future. If you're doing submissions, so if you've got new products, you're making changes to products, then arrange pre-submission meetings with your regulatory body for guidance. Because you want to make sure you do what they want and how they want it, and they're happy to talk to you because that's what they want from you, is everything in the way they want it, because it makes their job easier to assess you. You're going to regularly want to update your SOPs, your standard operating procedures. You're going to regularly want to assess quality assurance processes. Are they doing what they're supposed to do? How's your quality control going? Like, how's that working for you? Is it catching, the quote unquote errors or discrepancies that it should be? Because if it's not, like if you have, your quality control is saying perfect, 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 and your quality assurance is saying, yeah, we're doing it all right, but then you're flooded with problems, people calling in saying, hey, it's not working or it's failing or whatever, then obviously there's something wrong with your QA and your QC. Finally, it's a big system. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of documentation. There are many people involved. It involves most, if not all, areas of the company. So you're definitely going to want to implement a data management system with specific tools to increase efficiency for your regulatory affairs. If your product doesn't meet regulatory compliance, then you will not get market authorization, and therefore you cannot sell. So as a company that's for profit in the medical sciences space, that's a big problem. So you're going to want to have a regulatory strategy. And essentially it is, how do I deal with regulatory compliance for any products I may have that are in the medical health space? So what is going to plug into your regulatory strategy are going to be things like your clinical studies, your validation, your clinical validation. What is going to support your claims of what your product does is going to impact your regulatory strategy, because depending on what your claims are will depend on what level of compliance you need to meet, and what's going to change in that space over time. So that's very important. Another thing that's going to impact your regulatory strategy is going to be the profile, of your product. The type of product that you are manufacturing or developing is going to impact your regulatory strategy, because you're going to have to define, based on your target product and its profile, what the objectives are. And basically you start with where you end up, right? Which is, what do you need in order to sell? And so that's going to be put into the regulatory strategy as well. That what's the end game? What's the objective? Considering your product and its profile. And finally, of course, the output from your regulatory strategy is going to be your filings, right? So your regulatory filings, which means what do you file in with your regulatory body in order to make your product compliant, and so that they provide you with market authorization. And that's, inevitably the goal is to become compliant and to remain compliant. So you're going to ask, okay, once I put all this through, I've thought it through, I've put my strategy together, I filed, and I've been successful, right? So you're in market and you have your status and everything is good. So is that it? Well, no, of course not. That's the job of the regulatory body, is to make sure that you remain compliant, because as I said, over time, things can change in terms of what the requirements are in order to be compliant, and so you have to make adjustments for that. But also your product could change, very simply because a supplier changes for you in terms of how you what you use to manufacture your product changes. And because of that, it changes a little bit in terms of your processes or how things are done or how things are checked. And because of that, you may fall out of compliance if you don't make changes to how you do things and how you check things. And so the regulatory body, that's their job, is to come in and audit you to make sure that you remain compliant forevermore on the sale of this product. The regulatory affairs department of your company is not going to be regarded as the sexiest department of your company. There's no doubt about that. However, everyone does appreciate it's very important. Also, many people regard the regulatory body as kind of a mean, oversight, grumpy process, right? But it's really not. I mean, it's providing a service. I mean, the regulatory body is a service for you to make sure that it's fair, right? So what you do, what you put on the market is fair, and it's safe, right? That's the purpose, is to make sure that what you're saying, what you're claiming is a fair claim, meaning that it's justified, and that it's safe, that this is a safe product for use. And so it is a service that you benefit from, because without it, then it would be terrible, right? Because you'd have products that are great and you have products that are terrible, and people would have to make up their minds on, have to make their own decision, their own validation as to what to buy. And then of course you'd have people harmed if if they chose the poor product. It would be terrible. And everyone realizes that. But I think what people don't necessarily realize is that the regulatory bodies actually do make an effort to make it as easy, may not be the way to describe it, but approachable as possible for you to do what you need to do in order to be compliant. And so here's an example: the EU clinical trial regulation. This is a new system that has been brought in to harmonize and simplify the clinical trial process in the EU. So here's an example of an initiative where they're really, really, really trying to make it as I said, approachable as possible for you to do what you need to do to be compliant. Another example is the FDA in the United States that are focusing on what we call accelerated development. So they're emphasizing rapid development of complex therapeutic products, and what they're doing is they're utilizing FDA's pilot programs and initiatives in order to expedite product development. And you're going to ask, why are they doing this? Well, because that is an important feature of any company if they can get to market fast. And the reason for that is because if they're benefiting from a new technology or a latest development or something like that, they want to outcompete other potential companies that are thinking of the same thing by getting to market first. And so if you're able to get everything together and put everything together and organize it and plan it and test it and validate it faster than other people, then why shouldn't you benefit from that by being successful in market first? And so the FDA realizes that that's an important consideration for many companies, and so they are supporting that. So there's another example of how the regulatory bodies are trying to encourage and trying to make the process beneficial for everyone involved. Another initiative by the FDA is called Project Frontrunner, and this is where it encourages early stage development of, in this case, cancer therapies. And so, the focus is developing therapies for, advanced diseases, but to support earlier clinical settings and hopefully resulting in quicker access to innovative treatments. So that's the reason they're supporting this, is that they realize that early stage development, early stage startups struggle. They have a hard time. And so if they figure if they support, the phase where companies struggle, maybe that will result in quicker access to innovative treatments of the population. And so they're supporting this. And this is just another example of how the regulatory bodies are getting involved in order to to try and improve bench to bedside innovation. Well, this brings us to the end of lecture 6 and actually to the end of this course. So I'd like to thank you very much for taking the course. I really hope you enjoyed it. And I certainly hope that you will consider a startup of your own. And if you do, please reach out and let me know how it goes.